Hello, everyone, and welcome to a roundtable on the Russian invasion of Ukraine here in the School of Politics and Global Studies. My name is Thorin Wright. I am an associate professor here in the School of Politics and Global Studies of Political Science. And I teach and research on international conflict and the dynamics of human rights abuse. I've published research on interstate conflict onset, as well as conflict escalation to war, as well as how international conflict affects both human rights practices and as well as and also how refugee crises affect human rights practices. I also serve as the Associate Director for Graduate Studies here in SPGS. And in addition to our in-person programs on political science, we have an MA and a PhD program. We also have two online MA programs in international relations, one in international affairs and leadership, as well as one in global security, for which I teach a class pretty regularly, as does one of our panelists, Candace Rondeaux. I'd also like to introduce the other panelists. Tim Peterson is an associate professor of international relations here in SPGS. His primary research areas are foreign policy, international political economy, armed conflict, and human rights. He's researched extensively and published extensively on US foreign policy with an emphasis on the uses of economic sanctions and foreign aid. I'd also like to introduce Margaret Hanson. She's an assistant professor with a specialty in comparative politics. Her primary research areas are on authoritarian politics and factors which stabilize or undermine dictators' control. Regionally, she focuses on the former Soviet Union and specializes in Central Asian politics. And her book manuscript, Managing the Predatory State, examines how personalist dictators balance the costs and consequences of relying on corruption to rule. We're also joined by Candace Rondeaux, who is a professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies, as well as a fellow at the Center on the Future of War and New America. Her research is primarily devoted to the intersection of technological transformation and the changing character of conflict and geopolitical competition. She's authored 3 major reports on Russia's proxy war strategy and the Kremlin's mercenary networks, and has worked on a book on the same subject. She's also a contributing writer for the Daily Beast and a columnist for World Politics Review. Well, thank you all. We have a rather large crowd today, and that's really exciting. Thank you for coming. I want to start the roundtable with kind of a brief summary of where the conflict is right now. Today is March, and this is being recorded so folks can use it as a teaching tool. But today is March 21st, 2022. We're now nearly 1 month since Russia launched its invasion on February 24th. Current estimates of casualties and deaths are about 7,000 Russian combat deaths. This is coming from an unofficial estimate on the Pentagon reported in the New York Times yesterday. Ukrainian sources have it about twice that, but the Pentagon puts it at about 7K. For comparison, the US lost less than half of that in terms of soldier combat deaths in Afghanistan over the 20-year period. So that's in 1 month. Estimates from the UNHCR, which is the UN Human Rights Commission, put civilian deaths at nearly 1,000, but that is likely an extreme undercount. And it'll be likely some time before we get a clear sense of civilian casualties, civilian deaths, as well as a full and counting of combat deaths as well. Kiev is still under Ukrainian control, but it is getting heavily shelled every day. Russia is laying siege to Mariupol in the southeast, but so far, Ukraine has not ceded it. Most of the Russian gains are in the southeastern part of the country, where they had connections to the separatist regions, semi-autonomous regions of in the east, as well as the Crimean Peninsula. And currently, US and Western European states are providing weapons, aid, safe haven for refugees. Ukrainian military victories, such that they are right now, they've held on stronger than anyone would have expected a month in. And they're doing so largely with the help of American-made weapons and this kind of logistical support from NATO countries without any official entrance or formal entrance by NATO or NATO states. So that's a brief summary of where things are right now on March 21st. I want to give, to start the roundtable, I want to give a background in some international relations research and interstate conflict research that can help us understand and maybe provide frameworks for understanding events as they unfold in the over the course of the war in the weeks, months to come. One thing I want to focus on is a framework known as the bargaining framework in IR research. And what this focuses on is war as a function of a disagreement over military capabilities. And it focuses largely on two mechanisms. One is the lack of credible commitments to a peaceful settlement, and the other is information or misinformation on the capabilities of each side. One thing that warfighting does is it provides information on these capabilities. A couple of things about the launching of the conflict from the perspective of Russia seems very clear that they did not have either the information or misjudged the information that they did have on Ukrainian willingness to resist Russian aggression, as well as Ukrainian capability to resist Russian aggression and their willingness to incur costs. It seems like over the course of the last month that the Ukrainian resistance is much stronger than Russia anticipated, as well as the willingness of the Ukrainian government to withstand costs is very, very high. That civilian death estimate of around 900 that the UNHCR is reporting is probably likely a dramatic undercount, and Ukrainian losses are likely much, much higher, given the civilian, the kind of explicit targeting of civilian buildings, locations, shelters that Russian shelling seems to be focusing on. As the conflict progresses, a couple of things to look at, especially with the revelation of information, is the degree to which Ukraine indicates that they are hitting their limit for the willingness to incur continued costs, as well as Russia's willingness to incur costs. That estimate of 7,000 combat deaths on the Russian side is likely much higher than they anticipated. There are reports of dwindling morale among Russian soldiers, which could indicate that the willingness to incur costs on the Russian side are approaching their breaking point as well. This may provide an opportunity for meaningful negotiations toward a ceasefire. However, research also points to the notion that battle victory inconsistencies across a war can lead to different anticipated estimates of countries' willingness to keep fighting and what those perceived costs of continuing the fight are. So if you look across the map of Ukraine right now, what we have is not, while Ukraine is doing much better than expected against a major power, its victories have been inconsistent at best. They have taken territorial losses in the southeast, but you can also point to a defiant Ukraine in and around Kyiv, which would allow for a kind of an inconsistent picture of which side might be winning the overall contest. It's research has shown that this kind of inconsistency might exacerbate an information problem, which makes ceasefires negotiated in these kinds of settings unlikely to last. And so this is a concern right now. So when we see consistent efforts by Ukrainian and Russian negotiators to talk almost every workday in the last couple of weeks, but we haven't actually seen a resolution of any kind. And so we may not have a clear resolution or a viable distribution of gains and losses in terms of compromise on the issues at stake for some time. Another issue to think through is the degree to which the commitment to any potential settlement is credible. One issue that there are a couple of different issues at stake in which both sides have expressed kind of an unwillingness to settle on. One is the status of Crimea by the Ukrainians and an unwillingness to recognize the Russian annexation. And the other is this demand that Russia has that Ukraine never join NATO at any point in the future. I think that both of these will be key issues over which negotiations happen, if they actually do happen in earnest and we actually see the top executives meeting. But I don't know when we might see that based on this kind of framework and understanding. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to thinking about the role of the United States in NATO, as well as the European Union, and ask Tim Peterson what he thinks the effects of the sanctions are so far, and what impact they will have long-term, and if this kind of united front on sanctions can last long into the future.
Hi. So I want to start by talking about the fact that what Russia has done here is pretty shocking, a flagrant violation of the post-World War II norm against just violent territorial conquest. That's not to say we never see interstate war over territory. Territory is probably the most common reason war occurs, but more common is something called a fait accompli, just a quick land grab, often without a shot fired. It's what Russia did in Crimea in 2014. And that did lead to sanctions, but those sanctions arguably were not severe enough to make Russia think twice about continuing aggression. So what we've seen since this invasion in February is just massive, unprecedented multilateral cooperation to isolate Russia. I have a list of all of the features of the sanctions that have been imposed. I don't have time to read it all, so I'll just talk about some of the bigger things. So Russian banks have been kicked off of the international system that basically allows banks to talk to each other across borders. It's not the only way for money to move across borders, but it is probably the biggest way. It's called SWIFT. And it's a messaging system based in Belgium. In theory, it's neutral, but the United States, because of its dominant position in the international financial system, particularly when it's backed by allies and friendly states, can block entities, individuals, organizations, and sometimes even entire states from accessing this messaging system. And that's a big deal because it means it's much more difficult to engage in international commerce. So, a lot of Russian banks are now banned from SWIFT. We've also seen things like asset freezes. Russia had built up a lot of foreign reserves in recent years. It can no longer access most of those because US and a broad-based coalition of allies, not just NATO and Europe, we're talking Japan, South Korea as well, have frozen Russian assets. We've had travel bans. We've had all of the oligarchs that back Putin have been blocked from international transactions. Their property has been seized. There's been a lot of notorious news stories about multi-$100 million yachts being seized from oligarchs across the world. Some of those yachts are trying to outrun the enforcement, and they can't get fuel. It's a really interesting thing to watch. The bottom line is it's unprecedented how much cooperation is happening here. And so this leads to the fundamental question about this or any sanction, which is, do sanctions, quote unquote, work, right? And I think this is the first thing I want to really kind of delve into the IR theory about. If you're at the point where a sanction is imposed, in many cases, you've already passed the point where economic leverage would successfully coerce the state that you're trying to coerce. And so the idea that sanctions are going to work to make Russia pull out of Ukraine, well, we can get back to this. It's not extremely likely to happen. That does not mean that the sanctions are not effective, however, because effectiveness means a lot of different things. So one of the things effectiveness means is just punishing Russian aggression. For example, the Russian economy is just going to have a devastating impact from these sanctions. So, some of it is aimed specifically at the oligarchs, the strongmen, the elites at the top who are responsible. But lots of businesses are pulling out of Russia. The average citizens are gonna feel it too. And the initial idea behind sanctions was that the citizens feel the hurt, they get angry, and they rise up against the leader. Of course, history has shown that in many cases, instead, what you see is a rally around the flag. And so it's unclear if that would actually happen here. But that punishment is happening. And it is something that will be witnessed by not just the Russian government itself, but also third parties who may be considering similar kinds of aggression, right? China is probably paying a whole lot of attention to what happens here. If the West fails to maintain pressure on Russia, and so far, like I've said, it's been unprecedented, it's been strong, it's been like a hammer. But if over time, states like Germany who have halted the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, even though it was quite dependent on Russian gas, if it can't maintain cooperation with allied states, and can't isolate Russia despite this flagrant territorial aggression, well, then maybe China is going to see that as a free ticket, right, to engage in its own aggression, maybe against Taiwan or other areas. So that's, when we talk about effectiveness of sanctions, we need to think beyond just, is Russia going to give in? Because that's a high bar that we usually don't clear. What else do I want to talk about? So one other thing to keep in mind about effectiveness of sanctions is just, like, materially speaking, weakening Russia, making it harder for Russia to engage in future aggression. There have been unprecedented, I keep using that word, increases in dual use export control enforcement. A lot of countries are no longer going to export to Russia goods and technology that, while they may have civilian purposes, things like computers, telecommunications, they also can be used by the military. So that's the definition of a dual use good. Russia's going to have a very hard time getting a lot of this material, and it doesn't build a lot of this stuff domestically. Right? Russia basically produces and exports petrochemicals, that's minerals, things, raw resources for the most part, and it's going to have a harder time getting these high-tech goods that it needs for its military to be, competent in the future. So this is another, I think, an important point that we can think about as an effectiveness of sanctions, assuming that the states who are currently doing very well mobilizing together continue to maintain that cooperation. And I mean, I've talked a bit already. I don't want to go too long. I can answer further questions. My own research thinks a lot about how third parties will respond to this, and in particular, China is in a position where it's a much stronger state than Russia, whereas Russia is arguably a declining power, and these sanctions may be enough to prevent Russian future aggression, or at least effectiveness thereof. China, there's more complication there because China is a much more powerful country, and it's a growing economy and a growing military. And so, if there are questions about that, we can discuss some of the considerations there. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tim. And also to the attendees, we do have a Q&A function, and I will be monitoring those questions and bringing them in to our panelists after this initial round of questions. I'd like to switch to kind of the domestic politics of authoritarian states, which is increasingly covered in the news. We're seeing coverage of what's happening inside Russia, but the politics of Russia are very different than the politics of the United States. And the politics of authoritarian states in general are very different than the politics of democracies. And so I'd like to pose to Margaret Hanson what we might expect to see in the politics of authoritarian states, as well as understanding what may or may not happen, or what is happening with the other former Soviet republics that are all throughout the region and their role in the current conflict.
Thanks, Dr. Wright. So I will start by talking about the domestic context in Russia and wrap up by just briefly discussing the other former Soviet states, but I'm happy to delve into that in more detail in the Q&A. So I want to start with the problems of domestic governance in a dictatorship. And so scholars of authoritarian politics broadly agree that dictators have to worry about two broad classes of threats, those from the masses and those from elites. And so I'm going to walk you through these divisions within the context of Russian politics and how things, at least right now, appear to be playing out. So with respect to the masses, something I've seen mentioned repeatedly in comment sections is, well, why don't the Russian people just sort of rise up and protest against the regime? But there are major barriers to collective action and protest in Russia that have always been quite high and have really been substantially ramped up in recent years and then in recent weeks. So there have been longstanding legal barriers to holding protests in Russia. So you need official permission to do this. And if the event that you want to hold is in opposition to the official line, you're not going to get that permission. And then if you decide to try and protest anyway, unauthorized protests always meet with a strong police response, but that's been, again, ramped up in recent years. And on top of that, even if you personally don't participate in a protest and you're not taking that risk of direct arrest through participation, there are fines and prison sentences for libel online, which can include calls for unsanctioned protests. So just writing a tweet or an Instagram post saying that, that could potentially be interpreted as calling for protest can land you in jail. And as a result of this ramping up of repression, there are really no leaders or organizations left in Russia at this point that can coordinate protests. And so there's this lack of coordination means that we are seeing fairly significant protests, in the thousands, but to expect those to explode in size to the extent that they might instigate regime change is probably unrealistic given these high barriers. And on top of that, you have an information problem. This is particularly acute in personalist dictatorships, where there's increasingly, independent media has been the last sort of bastions of independent media have left Russia. TV Dozh and some others are no longer operating in the country. And there's now very restricted access to social media, which creates another barrier to protests, because that's how a lot of these sort of get off the ground and increase in numbers. And of course, there's the alternate reality and the misinformation being propagated by the regime, which is very pervasive, and a lack of trust of official sources as well. So even among Russians who potentially have access to or the ability to, for example, read English language media, a lot of this official narrative still seeps its way in. And there's been a lot of attention paid as well to public support in Russia for the war effort. So scholars who focus specifically on public opinion in Russia are even hesitant right now to make any strong proclamations because given the current atmosphere of repression, it's very dangerous for people to express their true opinion. There is a significant swath of support for the Kremlin's line. And a lot of that is likely due to confirmation bias, so people believing what coincides with their pre-existing beliefs. And there's been a public opinion poll that's been widely cited that something like 80-something% of Russians support the war effort. But again, this was an official poll, and there was some messing with the statistics, for example, counting neutral responses as being in favor of the war effort. So again, any public opinion data in Russia right now is really suspect and difficult to interpret. We do see a large exodus of middle-class, well-informed, tech-savvy Russians overseas, which I think is an indicator that a lot of people, rather than choosing to voice things within Russia, are choosing to exit. So the other question is then, if the masses are unlikely to sort of react strongly enough to change things in Russia, what about elites? There's a lot of attention been paid to oligarchs. I think I saw a question in the Q&A pop up about that, but the oligarchs have been really politically neutered for quite a long time under Putin. So their deal was essentially continued access to wealth and a lavish lifestyle in exchange for steering clear of politics. So while they may be upset about how things are playing out, they don't necessarily have the political power to do much about it. There are a couple other classes of elites that are being affected by this who may end up becoming bigger players. One thing that I would keep an eye on are the regional elites, especially in ethnic republics. And this is for a few reasons. These are the major centers of oil production. And some of these areas have long sort of resented the fact that they are sending a lot of the money that's on their territory to Moscow, especially if oil exports get cut off by further action by the international community. This could increase resentment towards Moscow. And in addition, they're providing the lion's share of the Russian army, right? So if they're, by a lot of estimates, the army is majority non-ethnically Russian. So it's coming from these regions. If these people start coming home in body bags, that could precipitate splits from the regional elites. The security forces, of course, are the big players in Russian politics, right? So there's military and paramilitary forces. I think this is Candace's area of expertise, so I'll keep it brief. But here, the FSA, so the sort of inheritors of the KGB, are more elite. And then you have the everyday police who are in charge with doing things like repressing protesters. And then you have the army, which has long been in the tradition of a lot of authoritarian regimes kept very weak to avoid posing a challenge to Putin's personal rule. A strong army makes you more capable abroad, but it also makes you more able to carry out a coup and replace the current leader. And so this is part of the reason why we're seeing the army perform so badly, perhaps. There's a lot of conscripts, it's poorly funded, there's high levels of corruption. So while successful in keeping the army from threatening personalist rule, it doesn't turn it into a great force for actually fighting a war. And so the question is whether the ramping up of pressure can change the calculuses, especially among the security forces, regional elites, and if public opinion starts to turn against the regime, that could present an opportunity for some of those elites to ally with masses and capitalize on that domestic pressure. But right now, that's still, we've seen some minor indications of divisions among elites, but nothing major as of yet. I don't want to take up too much time. So in terms of the impact on other former Soviet republics, there's a high level of dependence in Central Asia on the Russian economy due to basically colonial vestiges of colonial practices in terms of how infrastructure for example, oil and gas in Kazakhstan, how it gets to markets is through Russia. So the Kazakh currency has tanked alongside the Russian ruble. At the same time, we've seen a lot of these republics remain officially neutral, in part because they fear they could be next. So Russia has in the past made explicit statements saying that parts of Kazakhstan actually belong to Russia. Obviously, they have made territorial grabs in Georgia. And so this, coupled with the high proportion of domestic GDPs in several countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan on remittances from workers in Russia, mean that the sanctions and the impact of this war are wide-reaching and likely to be very regionally destabilizing in ways that won't become apparent as immediately. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanson. Candace, what is the next kind of strategy shift? We're starting to see a strategy shift of Russia. It started as kind of a more straightforward conflict and where they moved their troops in, and now they're starting to really heavily rely on aerial bombardment. Is the Russian strategy for the fighting itself changing? And also, what role are those proxy actors in the East playing?
Thanks, Dr. Wright, and thanks to the other panelists as well. I think I would like to step back a little bit and sort of contextualize here. If we think about how long Ukraine has been at the center of conflict in the European continent now, it's been at least 8 years running. And we've seen Russia try out different iterations of a proxy warfare strategy where they have deployed so-called volunteers from the interior of Russia into the breakaway parts of Ukraine in Donbass, so in Luhansk and Donetsk areas, and then also in Crimea. That was the first thrust in February of 2014. And then we saw some resistance there, some unexpected, I think, resistance from Ukrainian locals that then forced Russia to adjust again, and then sort of reestablishing and rebranding the type of proxies that they sent in to so-called finish the job, right? And at least take those areas of Donbass and Crimea and secure them fully in that first, what we call Russian Spring 1.0. Now we're in Russian Spring 2.0. And we see that we are no longer in a proxy warfare scenario. That is not the dominant paradigm that we are in. We are in kind of a classic war of attrition on some levels, right? Where there is a direct clash. We have, parties to the conflict are very clearly defined, and there are proxy actors within that setting, but the dominant strategic paradigm is no longer a proxy warfare paradigm. Now we have a situation where we're talking about attrition being the dominant paradigm. And I think we want to talk about attrition on 2 or 3 different levels. First, let's just talk about sort of what it means in the context of the military action going on the ground in Ukraine. We have, I think, 2 kinds of attrition that we need to be paying attention to. One is the obvious, which is sort of the combat attrition, which you alluded to in terms of levels of casualties that have been sustained and will continue to be sustained over time. The numbers don't tell the entire story. Certainly the combat deaths don't tell the entire story. In fact, increasingly, we will see that it's actually the civilian casualties that really dictate a lot of the tempo of different strategies and tactics adopted by both sides. And we already are seeing that, where on the Ukrainian side, there's been a lot more attention paid to framing the narrative around who is the aggressor and taking that story not just out, in the European context, but taking it outside of Europe and messaging on that, going to Congress and giving a speech, going to different capitals around the world and, expressing this idea that Russia is the aggressor and that Ukraine in this scenario is the David to Russia's Goliath, right? And that is a part of the response to the combat level of attrition that we're seeing where civilian casualties are concerned. And we should expect that to continue until some other things change on the ground. Still in the military context, important to talk about operational attrition. And that is actually something that's not talked about very much in kind of in IR theory. It doesn't really necessarily even translate very well, but it literally breaks down to, are the tires on your, armored vehicles sufficiently inflated? Have you oiled, have you changed the oil in your truck or in your tank? Are you treating the materials that you need to get to and from your objective in a manner that will allow you to sustain your course, meet your objectives, and stay alive? And the answer for the Russians is no, no, and no. And this should surprise nobody, although I think it has surprised a lot of people who maybe are less familiar with the Russian military history, but this has been a perennial problem for the Russian military dating back to even the Bolshevik times, frankly. This idea of kind of needing to maintain logistical lines in a country that has the largest landmass in the world has been a perennial challenge for Russia. Interestingly, back in the day, Napoleon encountered that challenge himself when he tried to thrust into Russia during his offensives, and he lost because he underappreciated the length of the lines of communication, as we say. So that is from supply areas to the front lines, and then how much energy and resources it would take to maintain those lines through the duration of a given conflict. Where I think a lot of people have been paying attention, of course, is to the unexpected resistance of the Ukrainians. But it was by no means unexpected for anybody who has ever traveled to Ukraine. Certainly in the southeast areas, you would absolutely expect to see the kind of pace that you're seeing where the Russian military is concerned, largely because those are areas that historically have been sort of cared for by the regime in Kiev. This again is an old problem. It's decades old. It's possibly even centuries old, frankly. That those parts around Kherson and Mariupol, where the fighting is going so intensely right now, have long been kind of these ignored parts of Ukraine, and therefore they're under-resourced in terms of infrastructure. There's kind of a mixed feeling there in terms of population because there are more Russian speakers there, et cetera, et cetera. So we should expect that this military attrition, both on the combat side and the operational side, will continue to combine, I think, ultimately for a long-term stalemate. Why is that? In addition to the factors I just mentioned, there's another piece here that is really important to consider in terms of escalation risks. We have, I think, three kind of different types of escalation risks or kind of triggers for escalation risks. One is simply what Ukrainian forces are able to muster in terms of their response to the Russian onslaught. So far, they've managed to push back and make sure that there's some sort of ring around Kiev, but increasingly that's becoming more and more difficult for them to maintain. That is why President Zelensky has repeatedly called for either a no-fly zone or a means by which the Ukrainian military can retake command of the air areas. And he has not so far succeeded in that, but I think we'll see the entry of drones given by the United States and other NATO partners is going to change facts on the ground where that's concerned. Where the air superiority is concerned, facts on the ground will change. So that's one important risk, is just the adversarial resistance from Ukraine is likely to change in the next month or so. And that could change Russia's calculations on what it needs to do to press forward. The second piece is proxy forces. They are there. There are really, in effect, on both sides, you have foreign fighters coming from outside the country, although technically, I think we've kind of defined proxy forces as those who operate outside of the constitutional chain of command of a given combatant in the conflict. And so on the Ukrainian side, that's not quite the case, because their foreign legion actually does operate under the command of the Ukrainian constitution. On the Russian side, of course, you have these so-called, Russian mercenaries, the Wagner Group and so forth, even, some others that are, I think, less well known. There's a serious risk, because we're hearing, of course, about the Syrians, the Central African Republicans joining the fray. And where you have outsiders with no experience in the country operating in theater in contexts that they don't understand and cannot interpret well, the risk of human rights abuses escalates considerably. So that could also be a trigger. We could see some atrocities that then provoke a response from Ukraine and or outside of Ukraine, more importantly. So that's that last piece, is the external pressures that I think are really important to talk about in terms of escalation risks. Those continue on a number of different levels. So far, as Tim mentioned, the extreme comprehensiveness of the sanctions, the lockstep nature of the alliance that the United States and Europe have built in terms of being a united front on the sanctions has been very effective in creating a near stalemate today. And I think disincentivizes both sides, frankly, from entering into any kind of ceasefire. That pressure will continue. And in fact, it is the external sanctions and economic pressure will probably continue well past any kind of ceasefire, right? Because the real goal, I think, for the United States and for the coalition generally, is to ensure that Russia never returns to its current level of aggression. And to do that, you really simply have to bankrupt the entire country. And I think that's the end goal. And I think, that's not going to change, which means we are in for a very, very long war. We should expect to see one other trigger, some potential game changers I want to talk about. And then I think we should turn to Q&A, some game changers. In the next 2 to 3 weeks, we should expect to see a full-on Russian default on all of its debt. And that, unfortunately, will lead to a lot of turmoil inside the country. And I think there are, different scenarios that could occur. I don't think it will bring people out on the streets necessarily. I think, the Russian people are very, they have a great deal of patience and tolerance for this level of pain and sacrifice. It's something that's not new to them. And certainly there's sort of an intergenerational memory of what it takes to kind of get through, not a terpit, as we say, right? You have to, tolerate it as best you can. So I don't see protests, but what I do see as a response is potentially an intensification of the current circular firing squad between the major security agencies. So as you all may or may not know, the FSB has recently had a number of different arrests of high-level officials, in large part as this is sort of a classic, Kremlin response is to purge the roles, seek out the blame. Somebody else is responsible for this terrible strategy that didn't work out quite as we expected. That is going to have a knock-on effect for a long time. I would fully expect to see similar purges go on in the GRU and the SVR, which is the Foreign Intelligence Service, as this war goes on. And because they are technically the wallets, even their small wallets, their little change purses, they are an important part of the oligarchic structures that maintain wealth off book for Putin and his inner circle. And so that could be really problematic. Last, I'll just say the risk of miscalculation errors, particularly around missile fires. We've already seen one, hit near the Polish border. I think we should expect to see more of that and less intention around it. Perhaps a few more mistakes will lead to a territorial breach on NATO territory. And that is where I think that'll be another game changer in terms of how the United States and how NATO responds. Poland is clearly nervous. That is why they are pushing so hard for NATO to make some changes in terms of how it positions itself on Ukraine. So all this said, we are in for not months, but literally years of attrition warfare.
Thank you very much, Candace. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and these are really great. There are a couple I want to, that rather than ask specific questions, I'm going to try and tie some of these questions together a little bit. One question that was asked was noting that there's a lot of humanitarian aid being supplied by different governments and organizations to Ukraine, and asks us to comment on what the biggest challenges with supplying humanitarian aid are to their final destination. And I can speak a little bit to this from some of the studies I've done on both natural disasters and refugees. And I think one of the biggest concerns in war zones with humanitarian aid is aid capture. That it will not get to its primary destination or its intended destination from donors, countries, and things like that, but rather gets captured by one of the forces along the way. Or it gets doled out as some sort of like corrupt payoff to political supporters of either state or non-state actors. In Ukraine right now, it seems like at least the western route through Poland is still being maintained for humanitarian aid, but the concern is as aid goes east into Ukraine, and it seems like there's been a lot of difficulty getting humanitarian aid into the eastern part of the country, particularly in Mariupol. Candace, would you want to speak to that at all?
So that, I mean, it's an interesting question about sort of aid capture. I certainly would expect to see that in the Southeast, again, because of the particular circumstances there culturally, historically. As wars go on, we also know this, warlordism does tend to set in, and that is a real danger. I think it's certainly a real danger in the Southeast. I don't know about the center of the country in the West. I feel like there's a little bit more social and institutional infrastructure there in terms of aid delivery possibilities and prospects, as well as just right now, we're in a goodwill period where everybody's pulling together. We haven't reached starvation level in Ukraine. And we haven't seen actually, the Russians really effectively use starvation as a weapon against certain territories that they are trying to take. That's largely because they don't occupy anything in full, other than a few little pockets near these breakaway regions in Donbass. They don't really occupy anything. So, those conditions will shift though as things drag on. Starvation will become a weapon. It has been, Ukraine has been through this. The Holodomor was a weapon in the past for changing social facts on the ground, back in the 1930s under Stalin. But again, I will say, because of those historical reasons, I think many Ukrainians will have well prepared on some level for that eventuality. And in fact, that's why we're seeing so many leave this time. It was because of that historical memory. We've seen 3 million people leave in 1 month. That's incredible. That's incredible. And as we get closer to these higher levels of attrition on both sides, we should expect that number to double, at least, and within the year. So that's going to be the response. And then it becomes a question of who is left standing in these areas. And I think we'll see, within 6 months to maybe 9 months, there will be some warlordism. It will be visible. And it will start to have an effect on the way the outside world also perceives both Ukrainian and Russian forces. And so that's going to be also a challenge to manage.
Thank you. This reminds me of another kind of a related issue, which is, so as, and it's tied to Tim's work on sanctions, which is that as the sanctioning countries punish Russia with sanctions, they're also increasing aid Ukraine. And one of the concerns that I've thought of is that as more refugees come into host states throughout Western Europe, North America, and other places, if there is a dwindling, like we're in the goodwill period, if there is a dwindling amount of attention that will happen to refugees from Ukraine in terms of, and also dwindling amounts of aid as this conflict progresses. I'm concerned about the next wave of European elections. Or not maybe the next wave, but maybe the wave after that, in which potentially more anti-migrant attitudes or anti-refugee attitudes start to take hold in some of these elections. One of the things that we, in work I've done studying refugee crisis, is that as the number of refugees hosted in a country, you're more likely to see kind of anti-refugee sentiments foment in local politics and potentially worsening human rights conditions in those host states. This is a function of wealth, and so Western Europe is much better situated to host more refugees than, say, in the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis compared to Syria's neighbors. But I am concerned based on the experience that Western Europe had during the 2015 refugee crisis, that their attention span on this is going to dwindle pretty quickly. Tim, what might we think about in terms of the simultaneous sanctions politics and aid politics? What might we expect to see coming down the way for that?
I mean, I think I don't have much to add beyond what's already been said. I think when it's interesting. If I just read a story today that even China is bringing in some humanitarian aid to Ukraine, like $1.5 million or whatever, and so the logistics issues there seem to be the key challenges. Do you want me to just more broadly answer what I think is going to happen with the sanctions going forward? I have more thoughts on that, I think.
Sure.
I don't know for sure what's going to happen, but I think that if pressure keeps up the way it has been, we're going to see the Russian economy just, go into a tailspin. But what would really be, I think, a game changer would be if we see more broader cooperation on import bans on Russian oil, and including if countries like China get on board with that. If that happened, then you might actually see a disruption of the funds that the inner circle depends on. And if that doesn't happen, then I think this has already been said, we're probably not going to see a collapse of the regime, right? And now the oligarchs have been hurt a lot. I think one of the questions I saw asked about, can the oligarchs no longer live large outside of Russia? And I think that's right. But I think for the most part, they depend more on Putin than Putin does on them. And so as long as that oil money continues to come into Russia, and so far from what I understand, it is, we're not going to see a collapse of the regime. But we are going to see Russia falter, suffer. It's simply not going to be a major threat in a conventional military sense in the future. Of course, it also has nuclear weapons, so that does add a complexity here, right? That actually brings me to another point, and I think this gets to some of what Candace said. She's if sanctions are going to go on forever with no off-ramp, then Putin has no real reason to give in to them, right? It's for sanctions to be effective. It does require that the sanctioning states follow through with their threats, but it also requires that they set up an ability for relief if the target country cooperates, gives ground. And so the idea, I'm sure there's going to be some restrictions on Russia that last, but if there's no willingness of the US and its allies to relieve at least some of the sanctions, then sanctions no longer are a tool of coercion. They're just a tool of punishment.
Can I two-finger on that?
Sure.
A couple things. Oil is running, the oil that Russia is able to sell today is at $45 a barrel. That's a 50% drop in valuation. That will continue, especially after default. Once default happens, then you're talking about a 60% drop in valuation. And you only have right now one buyer, which is India, which has agreed to buy up to 15 million barrels of oil. Russia exports 4 million barrels a day. So India has agreed to buy basically 3 days supply. Russia is a country of close to 200 million people. They're living, many of them, in extreme poverty. Really, I see no way out for Russia when it comes to this war of attrition on economic sanctions. China is not a factor. China will never, ever allow itself to join a coalition with the United States in this near term. China will, and in fact is incentivized primarily by the oil and gas bargain that it is now getting from its junior partner in this, what is essentially the beginning of World War III. We should make no mistake about that. So, but China is not capable of buying all of Russia's oil. There's just too much of it, simply. And here is where I think we start to understand why we're talking right now about Ukraine and Russia and NATO and China kind of as these other outside external factors. It might make sense to us today, but I predict in 2-3 years' time, I think the world will start to understand that most petrostates will fight similar wars very soon. In large part because the transition is coming. Now, the transition to a green or greener economy and energy structure has been accelerated, much to, I think, Putin's surprise. Now, everybody in Europe wants to move as quickly as possible to get off oil and gas. It's not something that can happen overnight, but you have the Prime Minister of Finland saying 2027, you have somebody else saying 2035. Now suddenly the net zero needle is moving much closer to kind of the urgency that we would have liked to have seen even last year as we get closer on the 1.5 degree warming. Russia is motivated by that. Russia is going to war because it needs to get its oil and its gas and its arms and its raw commodities to market, and it cannot do so through the Baltics year round. It has to do so through the Sea. More importantly, it needs a particular price in order to survive. The price can neither be too low nor too high. If it's too high, it creates a bubble. If it's too low, it creates a bubble. So right now, $45 per barrel, that's really, we're talking about decades of irreparable damage to the economy. It's not about punishing, really, at this stage. There are no off-ramps. There are no off-ramps at all now. And that's why I think this escalation risk becomes even more material to the question. Why Putin is so willing to talk about the use of nuclear weapons, why we're hearing this sort of saber rattling around chemical and biological. We should expect to see it. We should absolutely expect to see it.
Candace, thank you very much. We have a time for maybe one more question, and there's one I think that Dr. Hanson can speak to, especially with the increase in sanctions as these go over time. The economic pressure on Russia will be immense, but it'll also be immense on those surrounding former Soviet republics. How might that shift their orientation toward Russia? And also in the outlying regions of Russia, how would these regional elites then, how might that affect their relationship with the Kremlin?
So in terms of the effect on the former Soviet republics in the region, I mean, in terms of the Baltics and Georgia, we've already seen a lot of concern and backlash against what's happening in Ukraine. In Central Asia and then Armenia and Azerbaijan, what we're seeing is that Armenia, for example, is rapidly becoming a destination for a lot of Russian human capital. Uzbekistan has also sought to capitalize on this flight by, for example, introducing 3-year work permits for Russians coming to the country. I think it's perhaps telling that, for example, Uzbekistan is the only country that has come out explicitly against the Russian policy and stated its support for Ukraine. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's also among the least dependent on Russia economically. Whereas we see, for example, in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where some 30% of the GDP comes from remittances from migrant workers in Russia. Kyrgyzstan has been repressing pro-Ukrainian protests, for example. So long-term, what that looks like, I think, is these countries are going to, particularly those with a high level of dependence on Russia, are going to face a lot of domestic instability in a region that's already struggling with domestic instability due to the fallout from Afghanistan, for example, and growing Islamist movements. So what we're likely to see, I don't know that, it doesn't seem that Russia has the capacity militarily to really launch an invasion of yet another country right now, based on what we're seeing in Ukraine. So I think sort of the regional effects are likely to just be a high level of destabilization, particularly in those states that are highly dependent on Russia economically and politically. Whereas you'll see others like, for example, Uzbekistan or Georgia trying to capitalize on this opportunity to plug holes in their own domestic economies in terms of human capital development in that respect. We also see increasing anti-Russian sentiment. With respect to the regional leaders, I think, Russia, this is often forgotten, I think, but some of these Russian republics have histories of separatist movements, and particularly, I think the demographic composition of the Russian army, coupled with where oil and gas resources are located, whether or not this does happen is a moving target, in part dependent on the continued strength of the internal Russian security forces and their ability to sort of put down any regional leaders who try to strike out. But certainly the sanctions, et cetera, I think create incentives as conditions on the ground potentially change against Moscow for some of these regions to perhaps revisit that idea, right, of striking out on their own. And again, this is very tied in with the energy sector.
Thank you very much. Candace, I wanted to ask one point of clarification on the last thing you said. You said we might expect to see the use of chemical and biological weapons, but not nuclear.
No, I think you can see both, actually. I can really see a situation where, so on the chemical and biological, I think that's imminent, right? I mean, I think, all the saber rattling and all the kind of like propaganda framing that we've seen, of this about Fort Detrick here in Maryland, which is, of course, historically had done some work for the United States government on biological and chemical weapons development, now is no longer doing that. Nonetheless, it's the boogeyman in all Russian propaganda. And that has been, pushed and pushed and pushed on various social media channels, in news stories, that Russia is kind of pushing out there. And we saw this in Syria, where before a chemical attack, oftentimes using, sarin or chlorine, in the beginning of the Syrian war, it was mostly sarin, and then eventually it kind of morphed into chlorine. That, we saw that kind of pre-staging, that pre-framing that the other guys, the rebel forces are going to do it. It's not going to be us. But in actual fact, it was almost always the regime that would perpetrate those attacks. So I think that that's a pretty good sign that that's where Russia is heading. Certainly, they're preparing the way psychologically so that they can explain what happens after the fact. And they clearly have no compunction about civilian casualties whatsoever or targeting civilians. That we can see with great precision. And so, but on the nukes, there are so many different reasons and factors that could feed into a decision to use a tactical nuclear weapon in the Ukrainian theater. One would be non-capitulation from Zelensky and the inability to decapitate him and his government, right? At a time when the stakes were running very high for Russia. That is sometime when it starts getting colder in Russia, basically. When it starts getting colder in Russia, we should expect, Putin's appetite for risk will increase considerably. People will be hungry, they will be tired, there will be less energy available for domestic consumption. There'll be lots of challenges there for him to manage. And assuming that even the best case scenario for Putin, where he manages with his troops to take Kyiv, I think we can all say with confidence that resistance will continue, and that Zelensky, whether he is leading that resistance or not is not material. There are just too many other folks inside of Ukraine and now outside of Ukraine who would like to return to their homes and return to a time before. And so the hope that somehow this is going to end quickly or that it's going to be over within a couple of months, I think is a false misnomer that we have to really be careful to think about as we're addressing the policy response to Russia's aggression.
Thank you very much. I want to briefly answer one question about from one of our professors, Valerie Mueller, noted that President Biden just pledged a significant amount of funds to the Ukraine war. What do you expect involvement from the US to look like in the future, 9 months and beyond? I expect most of the same. I don't expect US to change very much. I expect that we will continue to provide weapons and aid. I do not think it will go further than that. And if anyone wants to also chime in on that, I think that's where we are. I think the president's been fairly clear on formal NATO involvement or a no-fly zone, and I think they're looking for other ways around that right now in terms of the weapons that are being provided. Tim, would you, as a foreign policy expert, would you want to, or Candace?
I could share like one brief thing. I think that Biden, the US, NATO has been very clear that they don't want to get directly involved because that would spark an actual war between NATO and Russia. Just providing assistance and weapons technology that is likely to be the foreseeable future. As Candace mentioned, if Putin continues to essentially escalate because of a higher risk tolerance, that raises some interesting questions here. I mean, I've seen some criticism of the West basically along the lines that Putin's engaging in brinksmanship and the West is not countering that. And so I don't know exactly what to make of it. It makes for some troubling days ahead, I think.
I would say also, I agree with that, actually, that assessment. I think the Biden administration has done well to manage the sanctions response. Perhaps it has boxed himself in with this, commitment on not sending American boots on the ground. But that's okay, because actually that's not really the strong suit for the United States. There are other options available to the United States in terms of air and space that I think if they're not on the table now, they will be soon. And if they're not, then of course, I think we're really in big trouble in terms of, calculus for Putin and in terms of how he can continue to kind of assess NATO's response. But, it's important to recognize that NATO is a 28 member body that operates by consensus decisions. And it is totally true that the United States is the big dog in the room. And next to it is the UK and France. Germany really is more of a political player than a defensive player in this situation, just because they have not met their obligations. I do think that if we see punctures on the border with any one of these states, particularly Poland, we should really expect that actually then we'll see, I think, a different message coming out of the White House. But when will that change? Okay, well, it's not going to change before the midterms. It will change after the midterms, and where you can expect, some losses in the House, which will incentivize then the Democrats to think, oh no, what have we done? Why have we failed once again to consolidate our power? And it will, of course, put the fear of God in the DNC about the future for the White House and the 2024 battle. And that will make a lot of people who are on, kind of in the containment of Russia camp inside the White House, inside the administration, I think their voices will start to sing out a little bit louder. And we should expect then again, some rethinking of this commitment to not have American boots on the ground in Ukrainian territory. You don't need them in Ukrainian territory to be in the battle.
Okay, we have gone over, I think, the original allotted time by about 15 minutes. I want to thank all of our panelists and thank the audience. We had a very good turnout today. If the discussion, if it plays out as this discussion did, we may have to revisit this as a roundtable group in a few months, and certainly in the fall semester. So thank you all again, and I hope you found it helpful and informative.